Hey there, everyone. Ready to unlock some secrets?
Some system secrets? I'm in.
We're taking a deep dive
Oh,
today
I love a good deep dive.
into Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. It's a classic.
Yeah, for good reason. It's like a guidebook for understanding how the world works.
From economies to ecosystems to even a simple cup of coffee.
It's true. Systems are everywhere, but sometimes our intuition about them is, well, a little off.
Totally off. This book helps us see past those misconceptions.
It's like having X-ray vision for complexity.
Now, before we jump in, I think it's important to understand a bit about Donella Meadows herself. What can you tell us about her and why she wrote this book?
Well, Donella Meadows was this brilliant systems scientist.
A system scientist. So she was really into, like, the big picture stuff?
Exactly. She saw these connections everywhere, these patterns, and she was convinced that understanding systems was the key to solving all sorts of problems.
But she also knew that systems thinking could sound kind of intimidating, right?
Oh, yeah, like super academic. So she wrote, Thinking in Systems to make it accessible to everyone.
I love that. Making complex ideas simple. And one of the things that really helped me grasp the concept was that slinky analogy in the book.
Oh, yeah, the slinky. I love that one.
Imagine holding a slinky and it's bouncing and stretching in your hand.
Yeah.
What's making it do that? It's not just your hand moving it, right?
Like a slinky has a mind of its own.
Exactly. It's the system itself. So when we say systems, what are we really talking about?
A system is any group of interconnected parts working together to create a specific outcome.
Okay, so interconnected parts, like my morning routine is a system.
It could be you've got the alarm, the coffee maker, the shower, all working together to get you out the door.
And the outcome is, hopefully, a functioning human being.
Ideally. But the point is, it's the relationships between those parts that make the system tick.
Mm.
And those relationships can be pretty complex.
Which is why the book really stresses using visuals, those diagrams.
Visuals are key. They help us see those connections, how all the pieces fit together.
It's like a roadmap for the system. So we've got these interconnected parts, but what are the core components of a system? What makes a system tick?
Well, Meadows outlines three key components: the elements, the interconnections, and the purpose.
Elements, interconnections, purpose. Got it. Break those down for me.
The elements are the individual parts, like ingredients in a recipe. Then you have the interconnections. Those are the relationships between the elements, how they interact and influence each other.
So kind of like how sugar makes a cake sweet, but too much sugar can make it dense and crumbly.
Perfect example. And then there's the purpose, the system's overall goal or function.
So like, are we making a cake or a casserole? That changes everything, even if some ingredients are the same.
Exactly. The purpose is the driving force. Even if you swap out some elements, if the purpose stays the same, the system will essentially behave the same way.
Fascinating. Now, let's talk about stocks and flows. This is where things start to feel a little, I don't know, financial.
It might sound that way, but think of your bank account. The money you have right now, that's a stock.
Okay, so the money is the stock.
But your salary coming in, your bills going out, those are flows.
Stocks and flows, got it.
Stocks represent something that builds up or depletes over time, and flows are what cause those changes.
So in the book, Meadows uses the example of a bathtub.
Oh, the bathtub, that's a classic. The bathtub itself is the stock.
Makes sense. It's holding the water.
The water flowing in from the faucet, the water draining out, those are flows. And just like with your bank account, understanding those flows is key to knowing if the system is growing, shrinking, or staying the same.
It's interesting how stocks can act as buffers, like a shock absorber for a system,
Oh, yeah, like a company might keep a certain amount of inventory.
to deal those sudden changes in demand.
Exactly. Those buffers make things more stable, more resilient.
But here's the thing, sometimes those buffers can hide problems.
It's true. They can make us feel safe and secure.
But if we're not careful, those problems can just keep building up under the surface. Now let's move on to another key concept, feedback loops. I think this is where things get really interesting.
Feedback loops, they're the engine of a system.
The engine. Okay, I'm intrigued.
They're how actions create consequences, which then loop back and influence future actions. It's a cycle.
So it's not just a straight line from cause to effect, it's more like a continuous loop of cause and effect.
Exactly. And there are two main types of feedback loops, balancing and reinforcing. Balancing loops try to keep things stable.
Okay, like a thermostat.
Exactly. A thermostat is a great example. It keeps your house at a steady temperature.
So it's like I'm trapped in a feedback loop with my email inbox. The more I respond, the more they seem to come in.
Maybe. Balancing loops try to maintain a certain state, And then there are reinforcing loops. Those push things to grow or decline exponentially.
Reinforcing loops, those sound a bit more dramatic.
They can be. Think of compound interest. The more money you have, the more interest you earn, leading to even more money.
Ah, the dream. Or the nightmare, if it's debt spiraling out of control. But here's a question. What happens when there are delays in those feedback loops?
Delays can throw a system off balance.
Off balance. How so?
Imagine you're managing inventory for a car dealership. You order new cars based on current sales, but there's a delay between placing the order and receiving the cars.
So if sales suddenly spike, you might not have enough cars to meet demand.
Exactly. So you order a ton more to catch up, but by the time they arrive, demand has dropped. Now you have a lot full of unsold cars.
Those delays create this overshoot and undershoot pattern. It's like trying to dance to a song that keeps changing tempo.
Perfect analogy. And this happens all the time in businesses, ecosystems, and even our personal lives. Delays make things unpredictable and difficult to manage.
So the key takeaway is that understanding both the type of feedback loop and the delays involved is crucial to understanding how a system behaves.
It's like trying to read a map without knowing the scale or the legend. You might be able to follow the lines, but you'll have no idea where you're going.
All right, so we've got these feedback loops creating all sorts of patterns, but sometimes those patterns can get us into trouble.
Ah, you're talking about those system traps.
Meadows calls them archetypes.
Because they're these common patterns of dysfunction.
Okay, so let's unpack a few, starting with policy resistance. What's that all about?
Policy resistance, it's like when everyone's pulling in different directions and nothing gets done.
A stalemate.
Exactly. Each group has its own goals, often with limited information. No one's considering the impact on the whole system.
Can you give me a real-world example of this?
Sure. Imagine a city trying to deal with a housing shortage. So the government implements rent control to make housing more affordable.
Sounds like a good idea.
It does. But this can actually discourage developers from building new housing because they're worried about low returns on their investment. So a policy meant to increase affordable housing might actually make the shortage worse in the long run.
It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Even policies designed to help can backfire if we don't think about those unintended consequences.
That's policy resistance in action.
Okay, that's a bit sobering. What about the tragedy of the commons?
Ah, the classic overfishing example. Each fisherman tries to catch as many fish as possible, which leads to the collapse of the fish population. And that hurts everyone in the long run.
So it's this short-term thinking that leads to long-term disaster.
Unfortunately, yeah. But there are solutions. Some communities have implemented community-managed fisheries where local fishermen work together to set sustainable fishing practices.
That's inspiring. We don't have to be trapped in these cycles. We can find solutions if we work together.
It's about shifting our mindset from me to we.
Now, I'm a little afraid to ask about this next one, drift to low performance.
It can be a bit depressing.
Why is that?
Well, it happens when we lower our standards over time, often without even realizing it. We get used to a certain level of performance.
And then start accepting less and less.
Exactly. Think about a company that's slowly losing market share. At first, they might try to address the problem.
But if they don't see results right away,
They might start accepting the decline as inevitable. They lower their sales targets, cut back on innovation. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
so how do we avoid that downward spiral?
The key is to maintain high standards, always striving for excellence. Celebrate past successes, but don't rest on your laurels.
Keep pushing forward.
Always learning, always adapting. That's how you stay ahead of the curve.
Great advice. Now, this next trap feels really relevant today. Shifting the burden to the intervenor. What's that all about?
This happens when we rely on quick fixes instead of addressing the root causes of problems.
Like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Exactly. It might temporarily relieve the pain, but it won't actually heal the injury.
So give me an example of this in action.
Think about the overuse of pesticides in agriculture. At first, pesticides seem like a great solution.
Kill those pesky bugs.
Right, but over time, the pests become resistant. So farmers have to use even stronger and more frequent applications.
And that creates this dependence on pesticides, which can actually damage the soil.
Exactly. It masks the real problem and ultimately makes it worse.
So the quick fix becomes a crutch.
And that crutch can end up hurting us in the long run.
Okay, that's a great point. So the key is to address those underlying causes, not just the symptoms.
Treat the disease, not just the symptoms. It's about empowering the system to heal itself.
Okay, rule beating. It sounds a bit mischievous.
It can be. It's when people find ways to circumvent rules without technically breaking them, like finding loopholes in the tax code.
So it's a game of outsmarting the system.
Sometimes it is, and actually sometimes rule beating can be a sign that the rules themselves are flawed or outdated.
Interesting. So how do we design better rules?
Make them clear, flexible, and aligned with the system's goals. If people understand and buy into the rules, they're less likely to try to circumvent them.
Makes sense. All right, last one. Seeking the wrong goal. This sounds almost philosophical.
It is a bit philosophical. This trap happens when we focus on the wrong metrics or indicators of success.
So we might be achieving our stated goals, but those goals might not reflect the true well-being of the system.
Precisely. Meadows uses the example of using GNP as the sole measure of economic success. While GNP might be going up, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are happier or the environment is healthier.
It's like we're climbing the wrong ladder. We might reach the top, but it's not the destination we were hoping for.
Exactly. It's crucial to define goals that are truly aligned with what we value and that capture the overall health of the system.
This has been such a fascinating exploration of those system traps. They really highlight why systems behave in such surprising ways.
They're like hidden patterns in the fabric of reality. Once you start to see them, you can't unsee them.
Exactly. And they can be incredibly useful tools for problem solving. We can learn to recognize them, avoid them, and even use them to our advantage. But to do that, we need to understand where the leverage points are. Those places where a small change can have a big impact.
Ah, yes, leverage points. Those are the keys to the kingdom.
That's what we'll dive into next. Stay tuned.
I can't wait. Welcome back. Ready to talk leverage points?
Oh, I'm ready to pull some levers and see what happens.
Well, get ready for some system surgery. We're about to explore those points where we can nudge a system and create real change.
System surgery. Yeah. I like it. So Donella Meadows identified 12 leverage points, right?
She did, ranked from least to most effective.
From tweaking little things to completely transforming the system, we won't have time to cover all 12 today.
But we'll hit some of the most powerful ones.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So where do we start? What's the least effective leverage point?
It might surprise you, but it's numbers.
Numbers. Really? I would have thought changing the numbers would be a big deal.
It seems intuitive, right? Just adjust the dials, lower taxes, raise interest rates, but those are actually the least effective places to intervene.
So it's not as simple as just crunching the numbers.
Nope. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It might feel like you're doing something, but you're not addressing the underlying structure of the system.
Okay, I see. So if changing the numbers is like rearranging deck chairs, what's the next step up?
Buffers. Remember how we talked about stocks acting as those shock absorbers?
Yeah, like a company's inventory or a city's water reservoir.
Right. Changing the size of those buffers can sometimes help.
Make them bigger or smaller.
It depends on the situation. But even those changes can be limited by practical constraints.
Yeah, you can only build a reservoir so big, right?
Yeah.
And increasing a company's inventory can be expensive.
Exactly. Plus, it might not even solve the root of the problem. Like, if a city's facing water shortages, a bigger reservoir might help in the short term.
But if they don't address the underlying issue of water consumption,
those shortages will just keep coming back. Which brings us to a more powerful leverage point: delays.
Delays. We talked about how those can create those crazy oscillations in a system.
Right, those swings back and forth, like a car with a loose steering wheel.
You turn the wheel, but it takes forever to respond.
But here's the thing, if you can manage those delays, you can really smooth things out.
So are we talking about making delays shorter or longer?
It depends. Let's say you're building a new power plant.
Those usually take years to complete, right?
They do, which can make it hard to match energy supply with demand.
I can imagine. So in that case, a shorter delay is better.
It could be. Maybe use prefabricated components to speed up the process.
Makes sense. But when would you want to lengthen a delay?
Think about releasing pollutants into the environment.
Okay, that's something we definitely want to delay.
Right. Delaying the release gives nature more time to absorb and break down those pollutants. Maybe by treating the waste or finding ways to reduce it in the first place.
Okay, so it's about finding the right pace. Make the system work more effectively. Now let's get to those even more impactful leverage points. What about feedback loops?
Ah, yes, feedback loops. They're not just about understanding how a system works. They can actually be tools for change.
We can use them to our advantage.
Absolutely. Strengthening, balancing feedback loops can make a system more stable, more resilient.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Think of antitrust laws that prevent monopolies.
Those are designed to keep things balanced, right?
Exactly. They're like a system of checks and balances, preventing any one entity from becoming too dominant.
So it's about making sure no one gets too much power. What about weakening reinforcing feedback loops?
Well, that can be useful for controlling runaway growth or decline, like reducing interest rates to cool down an overheating economy, or investing in renewable energy to counteract fossil fuel dependence.
It's like turning down the volume on those loops that are getting out of control.
Exactly. Now, information flows, those are high leverage points too. Remember that story about electric meters in Dutch houses?
Oh yeah, the ones in the front hall. People could actually see their meter ticking away.
Right. And just having that visual feedback made a big difference in how much electricity they used.
It's amazing how just seeing the impact of our actions can change our behavior.
It is. And restricting information flow, well, that can lead to all sorts of problems. Corruption, inefficiency.
Which is why things like freedom of the press are so important, right?
Absolutely. Access to accurate information is crucial for a healthy system. Okay, now for one of the most powerful leverage points, goals.
The system's purpose. It's like setting a destination, right? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
Exactly. Meadows says the goal of a system is like its supreme commander.
The one in charge.
If the goal is wrong, if it doesn't reflect what's truly important, then everything else is kind of pointless.
So you could have all the right feedback loops and information flows, but if the system is aiming for the wrong target,
You'll end up in the wrong place. Think about our current economic system. The dominant goal is economic growth, measured by GDP.
right, we're always talking about GDP growth.
But GDP doesn't measure things like environmental sustainability or social well-being. It's a flawed goal.
So if we want to create a truly sustainable and just society, we need to aim for something different.
We need to redefine our goals. Shift our focus from narrow economic growth to something broader, like human well-being and planetary health.
That's a pretty big shift.
It is, but it all starts with recognizing that the goals we set for our systems are paramount. They drive everything else.
Okay, so we've gone through these leverage points from those numbers to changing the system's goals. But Meadows has one more, right? And it sounds like a doozy.
She does, and it's even more powerful, even more elusive. She calls it transcending paradigms.
Transcending paradigms. Okay, break that down for me.
A paradigm is basically a worldview. It's that set of beliefs and assumptions that shapes how we see the world, how we solve problems.
It's like those unwritten rules we all follow without even realizing it.
Exactly. And Meadows says that to truly change a system, sometimes we need to question those fundamental assumptions.
Step outside the box.
Exactly. Think outside the box. Consider completely new ways of thinking and being. It's like that Einstein quote, "We can't solve problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Meadows says that's the highest leverage point of all.
Why is that?
Because it allows us to break free from the limitations of our current paradigm, to create real transformative change.
It's like upgrading our mental operating system.
Exactly. But it's also the most challenging leverage point because it requires us to let go of those deeply held beliefs, to embrace uncertainty.
It's about stepping into the unknown, being willing to see the world with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
It's both liberating and terrifying.
It is both of those things, but it's also incredibly empowering. Once we realize those paradigms aren't fixed, they're just mental models, we can create new models that serve us better.
That's a pretty amazing thought, that we're not just stuck with the way things are. We can actually change our perception of reality.
We can change our reality.
Yeah.
So how do we actually put systems thinking into practice? How do we make this more than just theory?
Meadows offers some practical guidelines, right? She calls them dancing with systems.
She does. It's about understanding those rhythms of systems and learning to move with them, not against them.
Okay, I'm ready to learn those dance steps.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this dancing with systems. What moves do we need to learn?
Well, the first step is to get the beat of the system.
Get the beat.
Yeah, Meadows says this means paying attention to the long-term patterns, not just those day-to-day events.
So it's like seeing the forest for the trees.
Exactly. See those underlying trends that are shaping the system.
Okay, so once you get a feel for that rhythm,
Then you can start to understand the system's structure, those feedback loops, the delays.
right, all the stuff we've been talking about.
And that brings us to the next move. Expose your mental models to the light of day.
Ah, yes, those mental models.
Those assumptions we all carry around about how the world works.
Sometimes we don't even realize we have them.
It's true, they're like hidden biases, you know? Meadows says we need to talk about them, examine them.
So we can see if they're actually helping or hurting us.
Exactly. Shine a light on them. See what's really there.
I like that. And this ties into the next guideline. Honor, respect, and distribute information. We've talked about how important information flow is for a system.
Information is like the lifeblood of a system.
It's how those feedback loops work, how decisions are made.
Right. Meadows says we need to treat information like a precious resource.
Protect it from being distorted or manipulated.
Exactly. Be a savvy consumer of information. Don't just accept everything you hear or read.
Question the source, look for evidence.
Seek out diverse perspectives.
And on the flip side, we need to be honest and transparent in our own communication.
Absolutely.
Don't withhold information or spread misinformation.
Even if it seems convenient at the time.
Right, because it can have those ripple effects throughout the system.
Speaking of language, Meadows suggests that we use language with care and enrich it with systems concepts.
What does that mean?
Being precise in our language, avoiding jargon and ambiguity.
So we're learning a new language.
In a way, yes. A language that helps us talk about these complex systems.
And understand the world more clearly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, what's next?
This one is really important. Pay attention to what is important, not just what is quantifiable.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers.
Especially in our data-driven world.
But some things just can't be measured.
Love, happiness, purpose.
Right. Those things are hard to capture in a spreadsheet.
But they're still vitally important. Remember, those models and metrics are just tools. They're not the whole picture.
The map is not the territory.
Exactly. Okay, next up. Make feedback policies for feedback systems.
Feedback policies. What does that look like in practice?
It means designing policies that can adapt, respond to changes.
So not those rigid policies that break down as soon as something unexpected happens.
Right. We need systems that can learn and self-correct.
Okay, that makes sense.
What else? This one is really powerful and maybe a bit challenging. Go for the good of the whole.
The good of the whole. That sounds pretty idealistic.
It might sound that way. But Meadows is saying we need to shift our focus.
From individual self-interest to something bigger.
To the well-being of the entire system. Recognizing that we're all interconnected.
What's good for the whole is ultimately good for each of us.
Exactly. Moving beyond that win-lose mentality.
To a win-win approach. I like it.
And this requires us to listen to the wisdom of the system.
Yeah, systems have wisdom.
They do. Meadows says systems have their own intelligence. They've evolved over time.
So we need to respect that.
Observe how the system works, learn from it. Don't try to force it to do something it's not designed to do.
Work with the system, not against it.
Right. And lastly, locate responsibility in the system.
What does that mean?
It means understanding that problems often arise not from individual bad actors,
But from the way the system itself is structured.
You got it. Look beyond blame and punishment. Focus on redesigning the system.
To prevent those problems from happening in the first place.
Exactly. Take ownership of the systems we create and participate in.
Wow. These guidelines are so insightful. It's like a roadmap for understanding how to thrive in this complex world.
It's about being mindful, adaptable, and responsible.
Seeing the world through that system's lens, understanding those connections.
And realizing that we have the power to change things.
This has been an incredible deep dive into the world of systems thinking. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, listeners, systems are everywhere.
Start noticing them, start asking questions, start dancing.
Until next time, stay curious.